I'm talking to Mahesh Rangarajan, who is a professor of history and environmental studies at Ashoka University in Haryana, India. As we are talking, we are sitting in the middle of a nature reserve, Bjurkär, which is in Sweden. Now, this is a protected area, and one may think of the challenges to nature and the ways we protect nature against those challenges, and the kind of measures one perhaps needs to do. Now, how is it possible in a democracy with so many conflicting interests and needs to protect nature?
It's a question the whole world is grappling with, and it's perhaps countries like India where it's present in a more acute form. As you know, India is the world's largest democracy. It has had universal suffrage since 1952, but it is home to over 1.2 billion people. The reserve we're sitting in here in Sweden was created in 1955, and it includes a very lovely lake. We're sitting in a beech forest. In 1955, the government of the North Indian state of UP renamed a national park as the Cobbett National Park. And many years later, in 1973, it was here that Project Tiger, the world's then largest wildlife conservation program, was launched. Now, this national park had earlier been renamed after Haley, who was a British governor. It was a reserved forest, which was reserved for timber and for hunting by British officers and the local elites. But it has now been a national park for a long time and is one of the last homes of the tiger and other endangered fauna. Now, setting aside spaces for nature is complex in any large country, more so if there are people with longer lifespans, rising incomes, changing aspirations. So it requires a lot of consensus building among different sets of players and partners. And this is not always easy in an age of rapid economic change. The Cobbett Park has been an educational destination, a tourist destination for decades. But as we speak, there is a plan to build a very large multi-lane highway through the park to connect two different parts of the hill state in which it nestles. And the number of people who use the highway is large, but the number of people who benefit if the park ecology stays intact, if one takes the present and future into account, is larger. So how do we debate the preservation of heritage for the future against the demands of the present? It's a difficult question. There's no easy answer.
India is just on the threshold to elections. They are just about to be held as we are speaking. And the requirements for development, meaning different groups of people have different requests for a certain kind of development, and there will be enormous challenges on nature and on the coexistence of humans and nature, not least when it comes to, you mentioned highway, there's over the cities, there is the industrial areas and so forth. How can this be negotiated in India, being this large country with big challenges?
One of the obvious points to keep in mind is that when you have a country the size of Western Europe, there's bound to be great diversity of both ecology and culture. So the response which works in one region may not work in another. There are positives to development. There are two initiatives which have been taken up before this present government, but have been given probably more emphasis at the present government. One of them is to expand the reach of cooking gas to more people. Half the energy which is used to cook food in India comes from a biomass. A lot of it is from firewood, which can degrade the forest. Much of it is cow dung, which can result in less soil fertility. So the replacement of this with cooking gas, even though it may be a shift to a non-renewable resource, may actually help in those areas where people can afford cooking gas. The other point I want to mention is that over the last 25 years, one of the major issues in many parts of India is the pollution of rivers and of water sources. Now, even where political leaders have not been very effective in carrying through their pledges, many of them are competing with each other to say that theirs is the best party to keep the river clean. This is true of the river Ganga, important for religious as well as environmental reasons, but it's true of other rivers as well, such as the Narmada. So I think in both these cases, cooking energy, which is affordable and cleaner, and in the case of cooking gas, it also means much less indoor air pollution. Indoor air pollution due to wood smoke results in the premature death of hundreds of thousands of women in India. So it is possible in some cases to reconcile development and environment, but of course not always.
Seeing this in a global perspective, I mean, we are now in Sweden, and we saw in Scandinavia, namely Denmark, quite a number of years ago now, in the big UN meeting in Copenhagen, where there was a challenge raised by the certain countries in the south, challenging the Western countries for already having received or reached development, and that at the expense of colonized countries. Now, again, looking at the challenges for the countries that needs to take very large and quite rapid steps in order to reach development also for the poorest groups of the countries. How would you say that is again possible without what we have seen throughout history, authoritarian means? Is this possible by democratic means without the biggest tension it was cause society?
Well, of the major countries you are referring to, which raised these questions in Copenhagen when Barack Obama was president of the United States, three are quite vibrant democracies: Brazil, South Africa, and I might add India. Both Brazil and India have seen changes of government through the ballot box more than once. And India's of these is probably the longest lived democracy. So I think democratic systems are better than authoritarian because these debates can be out in the open. There are three kinds of checks which are there on possible environmental damages in a democracy. One is the courts. So even as we speak, the city I live in, Delhi, a state next to it, Haryana, had opened up a large part of the Aravalli mountain range for construction. There is a stay order on that because people critical of the destruction of not only the forest but the water sources of these mountains. It's a very old, very small hill range. They're not very tall mountains. Have gone to court. The other, of course, is public protest. So even as we speak, there's a west coast road being built near the great city of Bombay, also now known as Mumbai, and the fisher communities will not have a place to put nets or to offload the fish. These are small fishers. They do the fishing themselves. And they have done something very simple. They've used the social media and gone to the cable networks. They've gone to the press. And as you said, there are elections coming up. And these fishers are voters too. So the fish don't have a vote, but the fishers do. So my sense is that the existence of courts, the existence of the press, and very important in a country such as India, to some extent Brazil, South Africa, we have fairly significant communities of expertise, particularly in the sciences and ecology, who have been very active. Some years ago, it had been proposed large areas of the Western Ghats, there be some extra checks on development. The Western Ghats are one of the 10 biodiversity hotspots of the world. If you put 10 hotspots with lots of species of plants, animals, birds, the Western Ghats would be among them. And because of a lot of protest by the provincial governments, these plans were not carried through. The fact they were at least put up in proposal stage and some of the best biologists and scientists involved in them is important. And one of the states, Goa, implemented some of these plans. So my sense is that the existence of courts, of the media, and of expertise, and of open public debate is important as in any other country. It's especially important because these are sometimes issues where the negative effects may not be evident immediately. And political leaders, as anywhere else, certainly in a democracy, come for limited terms, 5 years in the Indian case. It is human and natural that they will see quick results. But there are some issues which will outlast a 5 or even a 10-year term in office. And I think through public debate, there have been efforts to mobilize opinion on these issues.
So there are space for nature in a democracy, but are there spaces for nature in an election?
This is depending on how you define the term nature. If you define nature as secluded spaces and national parks and sanctuaries, I'm sure you'll appreciate countries such as India, that's barely 5% of the land area. South Africa, not widely known, only about 10% of the land area. But many environmental issues do figure in elections. I think in the Indian case, drinking water or the difficulties of getting drinking water, sanitation definitely figures. In recent years, in some of the Indian cities, air pollution has been an important issue. Many of the world's worst polluted cities are in India. There's been an explosion, as you know, of the automobile, of construction, of other kinds of polluting industries. Similarly, in some parts of India, there is a lot of concern about the decline of very particular ecosystems which sustain a lot of people. So fishers along the coast have been quite anxious that the fishing grounds should not be damaged by pollution or by the entry of trawlers, and that the construction of new harbors and docks should not destroy the landing jetties where they bring in the fish. So there is some space in elections, but as anywhere else, elections are about the style of politics and they're about the rate of economic growth and jobs. Democracies across the world are not that different after all.
So, do you feel pessimistic or optimistic?
I think an objective person would be cautiously optimistic. You have to be cautious because you don't know what the future will hold. But there is room for optimism. A generation ago, if you look at the 60s, the Paddock brothers wrote a book where they argued that world food shortages would make it necessary for the US to choose which countries deserved food aid, and in their list, India did not even figure. Today, that is a thing of the past. There are still people in India who are poor, but certainly it's a country self-reliant in food. Similarly, in the 1970s, there was a study which said that by 2000, even if India has enough food, there will not be enough cooking energy because there will be no wood. Well, the surprise is there is wood, but it often comes from exotics such as the Prosopis juliflora, Mexican acacia, which has taken over large areas. It's invasive. But it has at least alleviated that wood crisis. So I'd say there is cautious ground for optimism, but the optimism depends on choices which are made now. And the choices will have to balance the immediate needs of growth with long-term ecological viability. And in the Indian case particularly, and this is true in much of Asia and Africa, it has to take into account not preservation of nature for its own sake only, but also the protection of ecological viability of rivers, of wetlands, of grazing grounds, of farmlands, of the inner city environment, so that livelihoods are not wiped out or livelihoods are not adversely affected. So in that sense, the environment, if looked at in an enlightened manner, need not be an issue only of the rich or the elites. It can be an issue which brings the middle class and the underclass together, not only for the present, but hopefully for the future.
Thank you, Mahesh.
Thank you.